Building relationships with students is very important for their academic success, but it can sometimes be tricky in terms of navigating the boundaries. What do good relationships look like and where should you draw the line? You're going to learn all about that right now. Hi, everybody. I'm Lee Hall from Literacy Teachers, and I'm all about helping you inspire, motivate, and change how your students read and write for academic success. Today, Erin Silcox is with us to talk to us about the importance of not just establishing relationships with your students, but also learning how to navigate and draw the line to set appropriate boundaries. So let's go check out what she has to say.
Setting clear boundaries is an incredible way to build trust with students that leads to genuine relationships. Doing so, however, is sometimes easier said than done. I'm going to share with you 3 tips for hitting that sweet spot where you're not being too lenient in a pushover, but you're not being so strict that kids can't get to know you. The key to all 3 of these things, the underlying principle, is consistency. You cannot waver, and in doing so, will make sure that you're predictable to students, which is kind of the sweet spot, if you will. You're showing students, I'm predictable, you can trust me, but you can't do anything in my classroom. First, one easy way to build a relationship through boundary setting is to get to know students and talk to students about themselves at the appropriate times. And this sounds kind of obvious and easy, like, duh, of course I'm going to get to know students when it's appropriate. But the boundary here is that you're deliberately going out of your way to have ongoing dialogue with students. Each student has something that you're talking to them about on an ongoing basis, whether it's their auntie who's sick or a book that they're reading or their soccer team or something like that, that you can come back to, and it can be several things over time, but you're talking to them at appropriate times, like I said, like during breaks. If you can, I don't know how your school operates, you probably can't eat lunch with them, but if you're just walking through the hall, you can kind of whisper quietly, depending on your school and what the rules are. But you know those times when you're not teaching and they're not expected to be doing any work. Find those times, especially with the most troubled kids who need it the most, to have this ongoing dialogue. So there's one part of the boundary. The other part of the boundary is that a lot of the times these students who struggle the most have a hard time not being tangential, shouting out, like trying to tell totally unrelated stories during class. And the way that this supports a relationship is you can say to them in class, hey, John, it's really not appropriate to be talking about your swim lesson right now that you had yesterday that you might think is a little bit related to this math problem. Let's talk about it later. And the key is to come back to it later. So if you need to write yourself a note or set a memo or something like that, that it is imperative that if you say to one of these kids, let's talk about this later, now is not appropriate, you have to come back and talk about it later. So you're setting the boundary. I talk to you about things that are important to you consistently, but I don't do it in inappropriate times. But if you try to bring something up at an inappropriate time, I'll tell you to stop and we will talk about it later. So it's kind of a more nuanced thing than just saying, hey, I talk to kids about what's going on in their life. Well, it's different than that. So you can see how that builds trust when you actually follow up with students. That's the first thing. The second idea about setting boundaries and in support of relationships with students is that you can share about yourself, but do so really deliberately. And so, one strategy that you might want to use is to actually write up a list of what makes you unique and sets you apart and kind of makes you a human to your students. What do you do outside of work? Or what about your job makes you so excited? And writing a list like this, where you've got all these options of things that make you you, you can go through it and say, wow, this is really not appropriate to share with students, or oh, they all already know this, or something like that. You can count some things out and come up with this sort of like top 10 who am I list that you can confidently and comfortably share with students, um, to let them in and, like I said, see you as a human. An important cautionary note here, though, is that yes, you want to share with your students who you are, what makes you you, but students, just like most people, prefer to talk about themselves. So don't take this and come at your kids and say, hey guys, get to know me. This is all about me, all about me. Balance the conversation and use those little tidbits about yourself kind of as a novelty, and use it to show students that you trust them with this sort of personal information, and you kind of want to let them in a little bit into your life, and that'll help build that trust with students because you show them that you trust them with a little bit of personal information. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, maintain healthy boundaries with all of the rules that you enforce. And what I mean by this is be consistent across the board with all of your students. Do not make exceptions to the rules that you hold to be important. And that means that no matter how much you trust a student, or no matter how much you kind of like one student more than the rest of them, you're going to hold every single student to every single rule that you uphold. If students know what you won't budge on and what you're okay with, the more that you stick to those same things every time, the less they're actually going to try to push those boundaries. Those boundaries will become pretty concrete for them. And you can even make a joke about it when a student says something like, hey, Miss G, can I throw this paper airplane? You can giggle and say, ha, that's a funny question. Why don't you ask me something I can say yes to? Why don't you ask me something you know that is okay? Students are going to start to be able to tell what you are okay with and what you're not, and they'll stop pushing those boundaries. Doing so will allow them to trust you, feel safe around you, and know that you have their best interest in mind. So if you like that video, click here for the next one.